We have already quite a few people, Esteban, so whenever you like, we can start.
So I think we can start. So welcome everybody to this new session of the synchronization workshop. This is the second edition of the metadata, semantic, and interoperability workshop. My name is Esteban González. I'm going to be the chair of this session. Okay, so we planned this workshop and this session, not only me. There is a very big team just behind us. For example, Nina Grau is also collaborating, so this is in fact one of the co-chairs, and also Anne-Sophie Finn. She will be the rapporteur of this workshop. So as I commented before, let me check this one. So I commented before, this is the second version of this workshop, and the aim of this workshop is to explore the semantic and technical interoperability adopted by representatives. Okay, so we are really interested in not just only focus on the recommendations given by the EOSC Interoperability Framework to monitor the different recommendations given by the framework, but also we want to identify the good and bad practices of each recommendation. Okay. So I'll give you some details for the session today. So the session will be recorded and just only for internal use for the reporter and the report writing. Also, we will have like two shared spreadsheet. The first one is contains the question you received the other day. That basically we identify 4 questions. I will explain later a bit the results that we get from your responses. And also we have another shared document, okay, that is also a spreadsheet where you can find the other question related with the recommendations given by the EOSC Interoperability Framework. And this is going to be our Word document. So the spreadsheet, please, the spreadsheet will be open, we can say, until December 10th. So I encourage you to try to complete this spreadsheet, because I think the results could be very useful for all of us, not only for the Per Impact project, but all the projects related with EOS, even with the task forces. But it will be available for you. So if you want to add more information after the workshop, you can do it until the December 10. At December 10, we will freeze a version of the document. So you can take also notes in the note document. So you are very free feel to add comments to the document. Just only have to take into account that we are going to work all together with a spreadsheet. So just be careful when you edit in the cells, okay? And also, well, this is just a document. So remember that we will manage 2 spreadsheets, one with the questions, with the response of the question, and the other one with the Word document with the exercise to identify the results of the recommendations given by the EOSC Interoperability Framework. Also, we will use a Mentimeter, okay, to collect also information. Okay. So we have you have 2 main questions. The first one is, what does your project institution community do to implement semantic artifacts, like ontologies, vocabularies, etc.? But also we have another question that is related with the if you or in your institution, organization, or project, you publish your data and your metadata following the FAIR principles. Also, we will ask you about how to reuse if you reuse the data from other project, and also if we were interested to know the worst data practices adopted in your project. Don't worry, because this is anonymous, so we are not going to publish with your name the results. Okay. So I think I have, sorry, because I think I have a wrong document. because I'm so sorry because the presentation went a little bit different. So let me see. Okay, I was with a with a different. Yes, Alexandra. I think there's a question from Alexandra.
Yeah,
Let's go ahead.
thanks for that. So my question is that the question is not very clear, the first one. So the question number one says, what does your project do to implement semantic artifacts into your metadata? Do you want us to tell you how we annotate metadata with semantics or how we create semantics?
Both, if it's possible.
Oh, okay. So that's okay. So you want us to say how we create semantics, if we do, and then what? It's quite a big one, and then how we annotate the metadata with semantics.
Yeah, we are not just interested to write just I don't know, a very big document. It is just we need only some pointers that people can see it.
Yeah,
for example, if you have annotation, I don't know, protocol defined in some document, just point the URI and that's it. Yeah. So we are interested to identify these semantic practices. Okay.
Okay, but it's dual, like it's a dual question, two questions in there. How do you create your semantics? Because that's a big process as well. And then how do you annotate? So maybe like in my community, we have tools that are associated with the semantics that create the annotations into our data sets.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, clear. Thanks.
So I'm just so sorry because I'm just see that I shared another presentation. So this is basically similar. So we are going to start with a small exercise. So please enter to the Mentimeter and just put the code that you see in the slide. Everybody knows how to use Mentimeter? Yeah. Well, so let me start with okay. I'm sharing my screen. Come on, don't be shy.
While we wait, Esteban, there was a question from Tommy about the role of those who are supposed to fill in the survey, the spreadsheet. He was asking, is supposed to be for data repository manager, what happens if another people with a person with another role is involved?
So what is the exactly question?
So he's asking, the questions in the spreadsheet are oriented for data repository managers. If the role is something else, our response is to this making any sense.
Well, it can make sense, okay, but I think it's also important to know the other perspective of the data reuse, okay, in this case. So I've seen a lot of responses. That's really nice. That describe and contemplate. So the idea of this exercise is I want to put in context all these concepts. Okay, the idea is to work all together in the same page. Okay, so metadata is a form of data that describe and contextualize the data set, data that help to understand and use code. It's not about data. So I think there is an agreement, no, that this is basically a data that put in context the other data or the data that describing the data, etc. Okay, cool. So we are on the same page. So what do you understand by semantic artifact? Attached meaning, okay, cool. Only two responses. It is always difficult, no, to describe what is semantic, what is the semantic artifacts, no? No more responses? No,
I'm going to put, I'm trying to. It's an
Yeah.
interesting question.
Very controversial question.
That's a good one.
An umbrella term for controlling vocabularies, ontology, thesaurus. Cool. So it's interesting because you are identifying the different kind of semantic artifacts that you can use. For example, ontologies, terminologies, taxonomy, thesaurus, vocabularies, metadata schema. Okay, cool. Are expected to be resources bringing in the meaning. And for example, what do you think that is interesting to use semantic artifacts? So anyone has what do you think is important to use it? Or not is important, is some tricky things that ontologies, engineers produce. A structured and standardized way to add meaning, okay? So basically the semantic artifact will see that it's like a formalization, no, of the knowledge, basically. Okay, and there are different levels, no? From, we can say from the metadata schema that is more low levels of this formalization to the more complex formalization like ontologies. Okay, ontologies you can establish not only the attributes of the concepts, the different concepts, but also the relations between these concepts. Okay, it's a very powerful mechanism, okay, to express, to represent this knowledge, but this is always complex, okay, and difficult to use for users. I think this is one of the main barriers that people don't use ontologies. Okay. Cool. So let's move to the other question. What do you understand by interoperability? Okay. So metadata must be in a format that is used and adopted by the research community and for that domain. It is then when multiple data is integrated with a common format, may be seamlessly integrated. Okay, so one of the problems of interoperability is we have heterogeneous data, not only in format, but also in the concepts itself of this data. So from the interoperability point of view, why do you think that it's interesting to use semantic? The three concepts are connected? That would be the main point, the main question. What do you think? Just some volunteer. If not, I can point so to one of you. Don't be shy. Yes, go ahead.
Can I just make a comment that you need to maybe allow people a little bit of time to type in things?
Yeah.
So slow down.
So sorry.
Slow down.
Yeah. So sorry.
Because it is very difficult to listen to you and follow what you're saying, and at the same time order your thoughts and then type.
Okay. Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Anyone share a link? Thank you.
Esteban, you have some comments on the chat. You can like look on the chat. You have some comments.
I will try. Sorry, because I'm just looking for the. So, Jan, can you elaborate more your comment about the metadata schemas or the DCAT or ontologies?
Yeah, that's something that is a bit tricky, and I agree with the comment of Barbara. I'm not trying to say that she's wrong. It's hard to define where you stop considering things as semantic artifact. But if you take DCAT, they are well-structured classes with URI and so on. So it's an ontology in the end, although it's used for capturing metadata. And so when you have these kind of standards, well, they are semantic artifacts. They are also metadata schemas. So, but it's true that it's hard to fix the limit of where you define what to say, the limit with semantic artifact. However, semantic artifact in the way they've been defined in FAIR means that it's a machine actionable, machine readable conceptualization. So, well, a metadata schema is, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Whenever you use XML schematas, it contains a structured conceptualization. But then we always can enter the debate, and I see Barbara already raised a hand to answer.
So Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, very short. So I don't disagree, Jan. I see your point. I just want to say that normally, so metadata is a broader term, and it can also be a semantic artifact, but it must not be. So often it is not a semantic artifact for my part. So it's not machine actionable or so structured that you can actually use it as an ontology or something like that. DCAT is.
Then what do you call metadata? Sorry to interrupt. So what kind of metadata are we talking about?
A metadata schema.
That is not structured.
A metadata schema where you have fields defined in a proper way so that you can implement it. This is not always the case. Sometimes you have PDFs that describe the whole thing. Therefore, you have to make it interoperable. Ideally, or in 5 years or in 3 years, we have them all as semantic artifacts and all is fine. But it's not the case at the moment. That's my point.
Yeah, in my opinion, the metadata itself is not a semantic artifact, but if you have a schema behind to define this metadata, then from my point of view, there is some level of semantic behind that. Okay, low level, but at least one level of semantic. So, Alexandra?
Yeah, I will agree with the metadata definition that is data about the data or data about something. It could be the file system is metadata about, how you capture a file and everything like this. Semantics is a different thing, but there is we call DCAT, we call it a vocabulary, an RDF vocabulary. And these metadata schemas it's about how you use a vocabulary. Why do we call it a vocabulary? And separating the purpose of, for example, an ontology that is going to be used as values in a metadata field, and an ontology that is going to be a structure of my metadata or a schema of my metadata. And maybe we need to separate the meaning, the naming of them being called vocabularies. I see Jan has his hand up. Jan.
You just exemplify why we decided to stop using vocabularies versus ontology, because for me, an ontology is a conceptualization of the world. It does not imply, and that's not my definition, that's Gruber definition from 93, and that does not discard vocabularies. So vocabularies are also a conceptualization of the world, simple one, but still, they represent concepts and their definition. So that's why we use semantic artifact, because that avoids all this debate about what's an ontology, not an ontology, and because it's an endless discussion.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the semantic artifacts naming.
In many examples, except for the ones where indeed the metadata is just full text described in a PDF, which is not necessarily exploitable for machines. The rest comes with structure, an XML schema, contains semantics in there because it has a structure with defined concepts, although the definitions may be not well made explicit. There is a list of concepts there. And so you could consider that it's structured and therefore it's machine actionable because it's XML schema. So you can use for validating your XML description. So, I would make the distinction there. It's like everything that is machine actionable is a semantic artifact because it contains semantics, whether it's made fully explicit or not, because you can use it with machines. And the rest is like, okay, it contains semantic as well. Everything contains semantics. Everything has meaning. But then at some point you need to draw a boundary.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. And I also think that it's interesting. One of the comments is because when we talk about always, we are thinking in interoperability, we're just thinking of data, but there is another research artifact that could be interoperable between them, like for example, software and workflows, and also the services. Okay, so when we talk about interoperability, it is just not only we have to think about data, semantic artifact with data, metadata, etc. But also, I think it's important to think about the services and how these services can integrate in the same platform. That is basically the work that the EOSC Interoperability Framework is doing. Okay, to defining this with these protocols and these practices to integrate systems in the EOS. So, so about interoperability. So, yeah, Marco.
Yeah, sorry, just a small comment or maybe clarification for me about what you just said. In that sense, I agree with you in interoperability using services, but that's only one possible layer of interoperability. Because that's.
What do you say? One layer? Sorry.
Yeah, one only layer. I mean, that's only technical to me as an interoperability, while usually I speak of interoperability at a different level or different levels. So is it correct or do you think?
Yeah, in my opinion, and I will explain a little bit about the EOSC Interoperability Framework layers, there is more layers to integrate services, for example. Okay, it is just not only a technical layer. We can see defining the interfaces to collaborate between the different services, integrated services, but also it is important to say what is the information you exchange. It is not only about the protocol. I just put it on an example. So if you want to integrate, for example, in a data hub, some repositories, in my perspective, from the technical point of view, technical interoperability, we were talking about protocols, no? And the interface. For example, in the case of data repositories, that we can say that the most popular protocol is the OAI PMH, for example. This is a sequence of steps, no? But when talking about the semantic interoperability layer, we were talking about the information you exchange, no, to make this service interoperable. Okay, and also there is another layers where you define the property rights, the conditions rights, the governance of the services, etc. Okay, so from my point of view, it is not just exists in the interoperability problem just one layer. There are more layers. Okay? But probably some of you have a different point, so feel free to raise your hand. No? So in my perspective, I think you need semantics to make the interoperability if you want to interoperate the services. If not, if you don't have this semantic, it's very difficult to interoperate, okay, the services. In fact, the semantic, one of the things that provide you is a discovery. In fact, this is a machine readable, okay? It's a machine actionable mechanism to do it. Yeah? So thank you for all your responses. I didn't comment it before, but we are going to share all the responses, okay? So it will be available in the future. So any more questions regarding with this? No? So let's move, sorry. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to change my... No. let's continue. So from the Fair Impact projects, people from Work Package 5, coordinated by Michael Bergum, they're collecting a collection of definitions, not created by Fair Impact. We just take a definition from different EOS projects and other projects and these ones. So I just put it here. There's a glossary that we are producing in the project. So you can find the exact definition that we found about the metadata, semantic artifacts, and interoperability. So I think it's quite similar that you propose and you commented during the exercise. So I think we are more or less in the same page. So as I commented before, this is the second version of this workshop. So you can find here recommendation from the previous edition of this workshop. Basically, this recommendation was more cross-disciplinary work is needed, maintenance, sustainability, and governance of semantic artifacts deserve attention and agreement across disciplinary communities, and the FAIR at large community should intensify the work on crosswalks and mappings. Okay, so in the case of crosswalk and mappings, Jan is going to give us an inspiring talk later. So I prepared another Mentimeter, but because I remember when I read this one, I always I'm just question that, for example, what is the kind of work we need to align semantic artifacts? So I'm going to make a small exercise. So connect again to the Mentimeter and put the code you find in the slide. Yeah? I don't know if Sarah, Nina, can you copy the code in the chat if it's possible? Just move to the So my first question is, how do you increase the cross-disciplinary work to align semantic artifacts? Because always in the recommendation it's good to know what are the kind of things that you want to do, but the problem normally is how to do it. No? So I would like to know your opinions about this.
What exactly is the question? How do you increase
the cross-disciplinary work to align semantic artifacts?
I don't understand the question.
So sorry for my English. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky. So the idea is when you work with a semantic artifact, but you work with different semantic artifacts depending on the domain,
yeah,
you have to align them.
Yeah.
Even because even you are working in the same domain, you probably use different semantic artifacts like schemas, or another person use an ontology. So how do you combine all these semantic artifacts to express the same? Because the idea is to not only work in your domain or in your repository or in your community, just collaborate in the spirit of the interoperability is communicate your data, in this case, with data from different sources. Okay, and these different sources, they use different schemas, different ontologies, general different semantic
yeah. So maybe what do you do to provide cross-disciplinary?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Sorry.
But the question is in my mind also, who is you here? Because there are so many actors that are involved here at different levels. So you really, with you, are you really referring to us as, for instance, data producers or data stewards or repositories or even end users? I mean, I think all of these different groups or stakeholders or whatever you want to call them have different challenges, have different roles, and also different responsibilities. So what are your thoughts on who you is?
Yeah, I think any stakeholders. So maybe I think it could be interesting. I didn't thought about it before, sorry. But if you can include maybe in your response, well, the role, it will be very nice. Yeah, definitely so. Like, I don't know, as a data steward, I'm maybe we can, I don't know, create a mapping tool or a minimum vocab or these kind of things. Start with cross-disciplinary use cases and get the communities together. Sometimes it's very difficult, no, to get the communities together. I think, no, they always have a different point of view.
Can I just say that in order to create the mappings for the semantic artifacts, the first thing to do is to find what kind of semantic artifacts each community that you don't know is using.
Yeah, for sure. Linking them to top-level ontologies. Interesting. For example, I know that in Faircore 4 years project, they are working in this crosswalk tool, no? to generate these mappings between the different. In this case, I think they are working just only with the schemas. Okay, but this is a very interesting component that they are developing in their project. So also there is another text, is mapping minutes or blocker. What do you mean exactly with blockers? There is another response, interesting, about user upper ontologies to align the domain ontologies and mappings. Very interesting. So there is a person who writes that I work in an alliance to federate ontology repositories. So maybe you can, if you can turn on your microphone, really interesting to know more about this work. No?
That's me, Esteban, of course.
Ah, Clement. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's we. I mean, the way we increase cross-disciplinary work and align semantic artifact for us is really like building ontology repositories, domain by domain, and then federating them or trying to federate them. That's what also we are expecting to do or hoping to do in order to align semantic from different domain and communities. Yeah.
But you work only in an ontology level, right? You don't work in the...
You know that we use now ontology repositories or semantic artifact catalog to be inclusive in terms of the semantic scale that we described at the beginning of the call.
See, because Clement, is there any difference when you try to align, we can say, the same level of semantic artifact? It means metadata schema with another metadata schema in another domain, or an ontology in one domain to another ontology in another domain. And there is a difference regarding with when you're trying to align different level semantic artifacts like a metadata schema with ontologies. The approach is different.
On our side, no. We
Okay.
don't make any difference in terms of aligning different semantic artifacts. I mean, we can use standard and ways of representing alignment between semantic artifact, whatever the semantics artifact are, although there are some technical and semantic constraints when you do semantic artifact. For example, aligning all classes with scarce concept is not necessarily something that you do without paying a little bit of attention.
Okay. First domain case studies, okay, understand the practice, identify metadata schema and semantic artifacts that work across domain, okay. That is basically the work that they are doing in the warfare project. Right? Interesting. So, any other comment or no? So let's move to the other question. So, how can we intensify the work on crosswalks and mappings? Vocabulary services. Mm-hmm. This is always work, right? Make more examples available. I think it's really interesting. Anyone know some best practice document?
So you said about the best practices. There are different types of mappings, and for example, while Barbara is here as well, she's sharing the iAdapt working group of RDA. So iAdapt is an ontology that allows you to consistently describe observable properties, and you have to map to break down your observable property to the properties that the iAdapt provides. This is a mapping, and it has to be done in a certain way. And for example, the iAdapt framework provides training on how to do that. Hopefully in the future, you may have AI algorithms that can actually do some of these mappings semi-automatically, and then you can, as an expert, make sure that this is the right thing to be doing. When you create this type of mappings according to a mapping framework like iAdapt, which is really an ontology, then you can infer a lot of other mappings instead of having to manually maintain them.
Oh, so you use these machine learning techniques to make this?
That's a suggestion, because there is a very certain way of doing this kind of mappings, and later on, like in the future, not the very far future, these kind of mappings can be done semi-automatically. And I say semi because we always need the expert to make sure that what these algorithms suggest is valid. And I see Bo having his hand up.
Yeah, Bo, go ahead.
It was just to agree with that. I think actually large language models that we're seeing at the moment seems to have a real huge potential in this area. I think actually exactly as you use them if you program, you use Copilot when you program, something comparable to that for mapping semantic models, I think will be really useful and doable.
In fact, I know some people who are working to try to design ontologies using large language models. Okay, it's extremely interesting and complicated, I think, to teach this large language model how to model the ontologies. But I think it's a very interesting research field, right? Well, more responses, right? Ooh. Okay. So thank you for all your yeah, go ahead.
I just want to respond on the large scale LLMs models. We had a presentation in the first workshop on fair impact from someone from DataSite who actually was playing with LLMs and mappings. It gives some results, but nothing that you can use as such, because you need humans. You need to remember that LLM models are statistical models, so they don't have any clue about meanings of things, right? So they will just make correlations. They will not be able to fully build an ontology, for instance. because they don't understand the concepts. So there are people now working on trying to associate to these LLMs knowledge graphs and ontologies to help them get some meaning of things. But this is ongoing work. So
yeah, I know this work because they are trying to feed the large language model with the knowledge graph, no, to make more to add the reasoning feature to the large language model. Yeah, because they are no reasoning. As you commented, Jan, it's just only statistics. Okay. Just to try to just try to identify the next word. Okay, that there are no reasoning behind the large language model. I think Barbara has the raise her hand. Barbara.
I just wanted to say the same thing as Jan. So it's a combined approach between the LLM and ontological framework. Yeah. So what Alexander said was actually that we are not just using large language models, but we are also having this IADOPT framework. But there are many other frameworks that can be used for different purposes. So I think it's really a combination, but we are not yet very advanced in this. And the main problem for normal researchers is they cannot really use these semantic frameworks if you don't have a service that helps them to use them. So it's just for us, right, that we are so keen on semantic artifacts and we need to make it more accessible, and we are not yet there, but we are working on it.
Yeah, but I think it's difficult for researchers in general to use semantic artifacts because
therefore you need we have to make more accessible all these semantics because it's too abstract for them.
Yeah, maybe you can use the large language model to translate the natural questions.
Yeah, in fact, that's the idea. Yeah. But I had just written down that what we need is access across registries. We need access to all the semantic across registries, something that Jan is working for years. So I would love to see this happen at a certain point, because then everything else, it would be easier. But I know the complexity.
Yeah, it might be. Okay, so thank you for your responses. We are going to continue with the presentation. So I'm just going to move to the agenda because so we have a small introduction to the EOSC Interoperability Framework. We have like 2 inspiring talks by Jan and Alison Lister about maps and works, and also for Alison is going to talk about fair sharing and maybe the interoperability landscape of standards. Then we will move to an interactive session, and also we have a discussion session that basically we were conducting right now the discussion session. So probably I have more questions, but if we have time, I will plan. I will show you the question, but if not, we will just finish in the interactive session. So the details that I commented before, the spreadsheet. There will be open until December 10, so you can get more information. We can include you can include more information. Regarding the questions we meet, we received 10 responses, so thank you to all the participants, and I have some results. So that 70% of the responses they use any kind of semantic artifact. That's only 2 ontologies. There is the 70% of the people, of the participants who respond the questionnaire, they mention that they have some FAIR guidelines to publish their data. So this is really nice, and also the FAIR guideline is open. So the 40% of the reused of the participants reuse data from other domains. That's surprisingly for me. Okay, that's really interesting. And also, I just put it some of the words that the practices that, for example, the metadata using free text, that is always complicated. You use free text to define your metadata. There is no agreement on how to provide metadata inside communities. This is a very nice hot topic, okay, inside of the communities. The editors don't use the PID, the editors of the publication, don't use PID provided by authors to cite the data. And also the carelessness in using the context of open and private. So if you know more math data practices, just remember that you can include it in the survey that we send. I don't remember when you register in the system, I think. Okay, so you can contribute more math data processes. That I think this is always interesting, no? Not just to mention the things that, oh, okay, is everybody fine? It is also working properly. But I always think that the people learn about the mistakes that the other people produce, okay? So regarding with the EOSC Interoperability Framework, I'm going to comment some slides that Oscar Corcho, who is one of the co-chairs of the EOSC Interoperability Task Force, produced. So basically, I want to tell you that the EOSC Interoperability Framework is a set of policies and guidelines to enable interoperability of resources and services. Okay, so this is really interesting. It is not just only interoperability from the data point of view, but also of the services. So services that can be used for another members of the communities or different communities. So as I told you before, the EOSC Interoperability Framework established like 4 different layers. The technical interoperability, we will talk about infrastructure providers, services, is basically the way, the protocols to communicate different services inside of EOS in this case. The semantic interoperability at a semantic layer, okay, we can say to this interoperability, and this semantic layer talk about metadata schemas, just to define, you can use a metadata schema to define the services for sure, or an ontology. And then there is like 2 other layers, that is the organizational interoperability, that you define the governance, how to put all these things together. And there is a legal interoperability, no? When you define the licenses of the services or resources, the copyright, the data appreciation, the GDPR, etc. Okay, so today we are going to focus more in the 2 first layers, and there is another workshop on, I think, December 7th, that you will talk about the legal interoperability. So basically, this is the problems, needs, and recommendations identified by the EOSC Interoperability Framework. So we are going to work more in the recommendations. In fact, you can see a collection of a list of these recommendations. That is basically the definition of context, metadata, and data schema. It's important to have this definition and approved by the community. Created a semantic artifact with open licenses. Associated documented for semantic artifact. This is not only about I'm going to publish the semantic artifact, but nobody knows how to use it. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so you have a proper documentation. Okay, repositories, the need for repositories of semantic artifacts, a minimum metadata model, and cross-words discovery, etc. Okay, so there's a plenty of recommendation that we will work on that. I was just to mention that the EOSC Interoperability Task Force is conducting right now a landscape overview of semantic interoperability. So they are looking for use cases. So this is just a call for action. So if you have a use case that could be relevant to include in this study that they are conducting right now, you can do it very easily. You have to use one of the wizards, is semantic interoperability profile. I put there the URL of this tool. Even Barbara could give you more information about this tool. And if you want to contribute, please contact with me or Barbara, and I will just show you how to use the tool, and probably Barbara too. Okay. So this is a call for action. So if you have a use case, let's go ahead. Barbara?
It was just thumbs up. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So let's move to the inspiring talks. So the first is Jan Lafranc. So Jan, the floor is yours. I don't know if you have permission to share your screen.
Yes, I have. Do you see my screen now? And if I move like this, do you still see full screen or you see the presenter mode?
Full screen.
You can see full screen.
Full screen.
Full screen.
Yeah,
you have
so
10 minutes.
Thank you. I have 10 minutes. Okay, I thought it was 15. So I'll go very quickly through my slide then. And thanks for inviting me to give a presentation with a high stake, as I need to be inspiring. So that's not going to be an easy task. So I'm going to talk about mappings, and that's what I've been doing for the past 2 years, I think, in many of my presentation, and mappings in the context of semantic interoperability. Yeah, so going back to the roots, Esteban already gave a short introduction about about interoperability and the EOSC Interoperability Framework. But first, let's look at the definition they use in that framework about semantic interoperability. Actually, the EOSC Interoperability Framework is based on the European Interoperability Framework, which defines semantic interoperability as a way to ensure that the precise format and meaning of exchange data and information is preserved and understood throughout exchanges between parties. In other words, what is sent is what is understood, right? They even go a little bit further and they say that semantic interoperability for them cover both semantics and syntactics aspects. Now, the work that has been done in EOSC interoperability and the framework, and that's how we get some inspiration, actually try to identify the different components that are necessary for achieving semantic interoperability. And they identified 3 main elements that they call semantic business object, the semantic artifacts that they dissociate from the metadata. So actually, we could debate on that, and maybe that's something that could be updated. And they also talk about mappings, right? And they propose that basically each of these business objects should be supported by dedicated service, a metadata catalog, semantic artifact catalogs, and mapping repositories. They came up with recommendations, a lot of recommendations on the semantics and semantic artifacts and metadata. And there's one, the R5, which is focused on providing a minimum metadata model coming up from mappings with other metadata schemas and making these crosswalks and mappings discoverable. Briefly, again, the definition of semantic artifact. Maybe I shouldn't go too long on that because we've been discussing. This is an umbrella term, which really covers things that you need to have a machine-readable, machine-actionable conceptualization of the data, right? So it can be an ontology, a metadata schema, but it needs to be machine-actionable and or machine-readable. Now, what do we mean with mapping? And that's an interesting question. So the usual definition that comes to mind is what I'm showing here, is that you get data or information with this, talking about the same thing, but with different names, right? So you would have, for instance, a database that contains pictures of cats, and they call that domestic cat. And in another database, they will have the same images, but the guy decided to give the full species name. Felis silvestris catus. Now, for a human, that's fine. If you go through the 2 databases, you can understand that they are both the same. But for a computer, it cannot know that. So if you ask him to search through the 2 databases, he will not be able to give you both. It would just give you one or the other based on the query you're making. So you need to make that relation explicit, that basically domestic cat and Felis silvestris catus are the same thing. And that goes also for some other concepts that are a bit broader, like domestic animals, right? So the mappings are, in the end, relations that you need to specify for computer to actually understand the relation between 2 entities so that it can work on it and act upon it. This mapping, in the end, if you think about it, is just the relation between 2 entities. It's nothing more. Now, if you just have that, you can't really use the mapping, although that's the way they are published now. What you need is a lot of information around that mapping to actually be able to reuse and to work with the mapping validated. So you need to provide a lot of metadata so that mappings become a documented mapping and useful mapping. Actually, it contributes to verifying this mapping. And then you can have many mappings together. For instance, if you do a metadata to metadata schema mappings, then you will have a lot of mappings concerning these two metadata schemas that are called mapping sets or crosswalks. When do we need mappings? Well, we need them to integrate different information sources or systems, either as one information system or for enabling federated search across the system. Another use of mappings is when we develop ontologies. For the reuse, we are currently in the ontology development process using the mapping to try to reduce the ambiguities in information systems using different ontologies but the same concepts or related concepts. Here is another example of mapping, which is this way more practical. It's a mapping between car ontologies, which is being used in an information system. You can also do mappings with disease-related concepts in biomedical domain. You also have some mappings on metadata schemas, and I'm taking the example of some of our partners in FAIMPACT, the ConMeta project, which is providing metadata for research software, and then in order to align with other metadata schema is providing a lot of crosswalks with existing metadata schemas. So one of their idea with this crosswalk is that they want to actually avoid loss of information in the metadata when they go from one service to the other. So for instance, from GitHub to publish an archive code into Figshare, which will get the DOI from DataSite. And all these services have different metadata schemas. So you need to have some mapping to conserve and preserve the information. So what they did is develop their own metadata model and starting to do tabular mappings between their model, the ConMeta model, and for instance, DataSite that is shown here. So basically, this is a very basic mapping where you say one thing is equal to the other because there's no relation in the middle. So it's what we call the correspondence table, right? So in that case, it's rather simple, although I'm pretty sure they had a lot of trouble to actually come up with that correspondence table. And in the first workshop we organized about mapping in FAIMPACT, our colleague Milan Ostersek, who's working in the Semantic Interoperability Task Force, came up with a list of mapping problems that are difficult to resolve. So you have string-to-string mappings, you have string-to-object mappings, object-to-object mappings, and field-to-field mappings. And if you look at string-to-string mapping and string-to-object mapping problems, well, string to string is, well, you have different variation for encoding the same information. And he's providing the example with his name, right? So you will find resources and metadata where basically his name is a full name. He starts with first name, last name. In another one, it could be the opposite, last name, first name. Sometimes you just get the first letter of the first name and so on and so forth. So for human, you can work with that. It's painful. For a machine, you cannot tell that this is the same person we're talking about. So of course, he proposed a solution is that we all use an authoritative database to normalize the names, like ORCID, for instance, which will actually simplify the problem. There is another problem is when you transform string to an object in another metadata schema. And he's taking the example of, well, the simple DCT creator field, right, which will contain the name of the creator of an object. When you want to map it to DataSite creator, then you have one field that needs to be mapped to many fields, right? Which is a complete object, the DataSite creator, which contains the name type, given name, family name. So how do you do that kind of mapping? You also have field-to-field mapping problems, is when you get different vocabularies that are used to describe the same thing. So here in DataSite schema 4.3, you just have dataset. And then if you want to align it with the core resource vocabulary, then dataset is described as a long list of different datasets. So which one do you refer to? The whole list of core or just a subset of the list, right? So these are the main problems you can encounter with mapping. So mapping is not easy. Here is another example from the DataCite metadata schema, where they do that mapping with Dublin Core, and we encounter the same name. Dublin Core is a simple metadata schema, and it has much less information about the creator than DataCite. So how do you resolve that? So we've been talking about the different types of mapping. So we see mappings between ontologies and semantic artifacts, metadata schemas, if we want to keep the separation. I'm not even talking about people that are considering that mappings is data to data. It helps transforming data, because that's another problem for data integration. Now, how are these mappings stored? Usually they're stored within an ontology or as a machine-readable format, which is great. Most of the time, they are in tabular format and shared on GitHub, or sometimes in PDF, right? Or in research paper. I've been working with some colleagues in the UN. They use correspondence table between different classifications that are published on a yearly basis in a PDF. So you have to re-implement the thing. You can't use it straight with the machine. Which raises the question, can I reuse the mapping made by others? Because we've seen that mappings can come with a lot of issues that you need to resolve. It's time consuming, it's more expensive than what we think. So basically the question is, can we reuse this? In few exceptions, yes. For instance, in the biomedical domain, more and more, because they came up with FESM, which is the simple standard for simple mappings, object mappings, where basically they now have a full model for documenting their mappings they can share. It is the TSV format, but it can be serialized as RDF. So basically you have a machine executable version of the mappings that can be shared. Most of the time, no, you can't reuse. One, because it's really hard to find. You get to know a guy who knows a guy who knows where to find them. It depends on the communities you're working with. So if you want to work with mappings coming from other communities, that's networking that only gives you access. Even Google cannot help you in many cases. In some cases, these mappings are not published. They are not interoperable because the relation is often not explicit. When you put it in the table, it's just the relation can be extrapolated as same as or equivalent, right? And it's not reusable because there's no context explaining the reason for the mapping. There's no information about who created the mapping in many cases. So you cannot contact the person responsible for that to ask questions. And it's based on community standard practices and format, which requires often additional mappings. So the question is, what's the cost of being not fair and fair mapping? Because in the end, what I just pointed out is just the fact that currently in the landscape, mappings are definitively not fair, really hard to find, really hard to reuse, hardly interoperable. So what is the difference between not fair and fair? So if it's not fair, your mappings of a limited scope. Basically, it's just for your own use case. You keep it for you. Others have a hard time to reuse. So basically, all the work and effort you've done is kind of wasted because you have been put a lot of effort, but no one can actually build on it except you. And even if the person in the organization that did the mapping is gone, the person that comes next might have a hard time to reuse. There's no documentation associated with these mappings, which makes things even harder. There's no means to assess the quality of the mapping, which is very important when you start to build this kind of infrastructure. And there's no possibility to automate the mapping process. Basically, it's all manual and it's really painful. And basically, you end up in the situation that you cannot reuse, then therefore you redo, which adds more duplication of the mappings, which makes things complicated. Well, if you start thinking about making them fair, well, it adds value to the effort of mappings because then you can share them and people can reuse them, right? Instead of duplicating them. They can be used in other contexts, which means you can extend the scope of your mappings, and it reduces the mappings, the number of mappings, right? Which actually reduce the computing power necessary to use the mappings. And it also allows automation for information retrieval. So basically, let's make mapping fair, right? So the way I see mappings is like knitting. You try to knit information systems together right? And now you're just doing that manually. It takes a lot of time to actually make them and integrate them into the piece you want. If you start using the FAIR principles, then you can start automating this kind of process, and then you can produce more pieces, more integrated information systems. So the open questions, because I was supposed to get open questions, and these are questions that are driving us in FAIR Impact. What are the different types of mappings? Because we saw that you can map ontologies, you can map metadata schemas, string to string, string to object, and so on. Data mappings as well. So we need now to start calling them all mappings, because when we discuss about that, that leads to a lot of ambiguities in the conversations. And the second question, which drives our work, is how do we make this mapping fair? It's nice to say we have to make them fair, but then the question is how? And I will stop my presentation here, and I hope that I was not too long.
Thank you, Jean. I think there are some questions related with your. There are some responses related with these open questions. So I think Clement has a comment about the string-to-string mapping is polysemy. No. So Clement, could you elaborate more this comment?
Well, yeah, that was a provocative question a little bit. String to string is, we are turning around the question there. The mapping aspect is very much related to the idea of mapping conceptual objects that are identified with an ID or URI or some kind of identifier. So if we can still come back to the notion of the language, etc. But if we start to want to align string to string and call that a mapping, then it's basically not our job anymore. We are not in computer science stuff anymore. This is polysemy, and this is the work of people working in letters. I
think
string to string.
You misunderstood string to string. String to string is the variation of presenting the same thing in the string.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's what I call
that's
synonym.
important when you do meta. No, it's not a synonym. Clément Jonquet for computer is not the same than Jonquet Clément. Right. Although it's the same thing.
Yeah, but
it's just the order in the string.
The difference, I don't call the relation between Clément Jonquet and Jonquet Clément a mapping. This is not what I call a mapping.
What is it?
I will call a mapping between Clément Jonquet identified in a database at INRAE and eventually Clément Jonquet identified in a database in FAIR Impact project, and with two different identifiers, and the link between those two things, a mapping.
Yes, but that's just conceptual mapping.
Yeah.
It means it requires that all the metadata use the ID of Clément Jonquet in one database. Which is not necessarily the case. So if you do conceptual modeling and mappings between ontologies, I totally agree with you. But then the case is more complex when you start to look at metadata schema mappings, because that's where it's becoming more ugly, right? The metadata is a text field. So when people are filling things and information about you, they might do it in different ways. So how do you reconcile this metadata and make sure that you can align the systems? Which is at another level, and I agree, from ontology mapping.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily at the ontology level. It means that what we want to map is objects that are clearly identified. If a metadata schema does not clearly identify an object, then that object cannot be mapped. And I mean, you can ask the FAIR for yours people developing the MSCR, the objects that are defined in XML standard that are not clearly identified cannot be mapped. In order to map them, you need to generate IDs for them. And once you have IDs, then you map them. So it's also very important we stick to our own problem, otherwise we just open to tons of things that doesn't really fit in our. But
then
we want to know that Clément Jonquet and Jonquet Clément is the same thing. I totally agree with you that. And if a database uses something and a database uses something else, then the problem of those databases is not to be mapped. The problem of those databases is to use identifiers and then work on mapping those identifiers. But the first problem is to go from those strings to an ID system, to whatever ID system coming from whatever type of semantic artifact.
Yeah, so I can just the thing. That's what I was saying in the beginning of my presentation. That's your way of seeing mappings. But then if you talk to communities, there are different ways of talking about mapping. And for some people, the string to string is a mapping. And so that's why we need to actually really nail down the definition of what we call a mapping and what is not a mapping, sort of ontology work there, because there are so many different exceptions to that world. I mean, do you consider data to data mapping? Like transforming temperature in Celsius into Kelvin, but some people call that mappings, right? So where do you stop? Where do you start? And there's no, if you want, there's no clarification. So everybody, if you want, mapping is overloaded concept. And I've seen that in all the workshops that we've been running is like, there's so many different views. So one of the things we will try in the context of fair impact, and also we'll extend that into an RDA working group that we are going to create, is to actually bring all these people with the different concepts of mappings to actually come up with a common definition and see what we call mapping, what we don't call mapping, if we can have a classification and a better refinement of the concepts.
Well, if you look for that definition, Jan, you find it in the dictionary. Just look up the Petit Larousse and you find a definition for mapping. That's generic.
Yeah, I wish it would not be that easy.
Go, Barbara.
Jan, did you ask how we should call the mappings between ontologies? I thought we already agreed to use crosswalks for that. Or am I wrong?
So crosswalk is an ensemble of mappings. So we call that mappings if you do concept to concept. And then when you get many mappings for between one ontology and the second, so mapping set, it's called crosswalk.
Yeah, in
That's
fact,
the current
so
definition.
if I do a mapping between two ontologies and not two ontology concepts, for me, this is then a crosswalk. Or so between two concepts, it's a mapping, but between concepts and their relations, so between ontologies, it's a crosswalk. No?
I'm not sure I understand the distinction.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with Barbara at least.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm thinking
so
I
it
don't
means
understand
that
the point.
if I have two concepts, okay, then I call it a term or concept mapping. But if I have concepts and their relationships, so the whole graph, yeah, an ontology, a model, and another one, and I want to make a mapping between the two, then it's a crosswalk.
Yeah, but you will not do one mapping.
No, I do.
You will certainly have many mappings.
In fact, and
these
therefore
two
it is,
ontologies.
therefore it's a crosswalk.
Therefore, well, but the crosswalk is the ensemble of all the mappings you do between the two ontologies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And therefore,
In that case, we agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's no point in just doing two concepts.
Yeah, but I thought you had this question open, that how do we call these mappings?
What are the different types of mappings?
Yeah, but for
right, so
at least for these two, we have a term, right? We have found a term.
Well, if you look at Jérôme Eusena's work, it's called ontology alignment. It's not called mapping.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to point out. Is like there are way too many, way too many ways of calling the same thing.
Yeah, and I remember
and there are way too many exceptions, and it is an endless discussion. And when you're talking with people in a room, you talk about mappings, and you think you talk about the same thing, but then you realize that the guy is talking about data to data and not concept to concept. And people are talking about instance to instance. I mean, it's just like, okay, that's crazy. And it's not coming from me. It's just the way that the communities have been organized around
Maggie is
mapping.
completely
There
right.
needs to be a clarification.
We are confusing people. But I can tell you, I was in a lecture about just mappings at the University of Twente, and they used 20 different terms for it. Yes. Yeah. So then there needs to be an agreement here or in, I don't know, for EOS to just use specific terms and define them. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but we have to move to the next presentation. So thank you for all your comments. And if you have any open question, you have any comment, just put it in the notes or just send me an email and we'll send the emails to Jan. Okay, so Jan will have a little bit extra work, no, after the workshop. So let's move to Alison. Alison, the floor is yours. Sorry for the delay.
It's not a delay when you're talking through things, is it? I mean, you're here to talk and I'm only here to talk for 10 minutes to give people an overview of a few things that might be relevant. So I take second fiddle, which is a really great place to be, honestly. So thank you, everyone. I'm probably going to talk for about 10 minutes, maybe somewhere between 10 and 15. I do apologize because I'm aware that the time is 1:45. If you want me to talk for a shorter amount of time, I can squeeze it if you let me know. No, nothing. So I will go ahead and just go ahead with 10 to 15 minutes then. Well, I thought it finished in 10 minutes, Maggie. So do I need to make sure that my talk is finished in 10 minutes or am I an hour off here? Because I'm on UTC. Someone tells me what time I need to finish and I will.
Well, since this is not recorded with the aim to share with participants who may need to leave early, I think it's very sort of dishonest to have a program that is running over time. If discussion runs over time, that's okay, but I really came here to listen to these presentations today, but I have to leave at 12 sharp. So well, would you be able to shorten your talk, Alison? That would be really good.
I was aiming for 10 minutes anyway, so you should be able to get all of this. And if you have anything, you can just email me anyway, and I'm happy to chat with you anytime. Okay?
Yeah, even Maggie, we will find a way to share with you the presentation from Alison. Don't worry about it. Okay?
I'll do my best though, because I appreciate it. It's very kind of you to say that you came to listen. Right. I'm Alison Lister. I work for University of Oxford. I'm also part of Elixir, and I have contributed to some subgroups of an EOS task force, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. So I am involved in both of those, as well as being a co-chair in various RDA working groups. So I spend a lot of time around research data and interoperability. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about what fair sharing can do to help within the context of fair impact and the interoperability landscape of standards, but also those other aspects that fair sharing describes, databases and data policies. So for those who have not yet looked at fair sharing, or maybe have heard of it, but don't know exactly what it is, this is a very, very short summary. What we store in fair sharing are 3 different registries that describe standards, describe databases, and describe data policies. But more than that, my favorite part of fair sharing are the relationships among them. And this is where the interoperability aspect comes in. And I just love the way that we can create sort of a view of the research landscape and talk about those standards implemented by databases, those databases and standards recommended by policies, which standards extend to other standards, that kind of relationship. I should also say, as we're talking within EOSC and Elixir, we are also, fair sharing is a recommended interoperability resource within Elixir. And so we are very firmly placed within the interoperability landscape within EOSC. So we have a lot of different stakeholder groups, and I've put some cartoons there to entice you, but really there are just 3 main categories of those groups. There are people who come to fair sharing to use the information there to find a database or a standard that they need. There are those who come to fair sharing as a producer of the information there. So they're going to create a record with us that describes their database, that describes their standard. And finally, we have third-party tools. So these are the developers of tools who come to fair sharing and use its API to get all of the metadata that we provide for generally fair evaluation and data management planning, but lots of other reasons too. We have over 4,000 records among these 3 registries and a few collections of these. These are particular slices of these records according to a particular institute or organizational need. We have over 1,000 people who come and maintain their record with us, and across all research areas, not just the life sciences, even though you may have heard of us through Elixir. We work with a lot of different stakeholder groups to make sure the fields that we have to describe our standards databases and data policies are relevant to the communities that we serve, because our entire goal at Fair Sharing is to connect researchers and research support roles with those resources they need to enable FAIR. So we work with a lot of different funders, publishers, policymakers, infrastructures, and various community groups as well. If I take one example, I say we're agnostic, and we are, but if we just look in the life sciences for a quick survey, there are lots of data standards out there, and you guys know this. We have 800 terminologies in Fair Sharing, 650 of those are life science. The numbers in parentheses are the total numbers. The numbers outside of parentheses are the life science numbers. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and I am sure we don't have everything. There's always going to be new standards coming up. Notice also that we have a certain part of our standards registry that talks about identifiers. I'll come to that later. These are our records that describe different types of identifiers. But yes, we have lots and lots of resources. And how do we make sense of those? Well, in Fair Sharing, you can find what you need through a variety of different means. You can search through our subject hierarchy and find those according to a particular subject, but we're also talking about interoperability. So we want to be able to find things that sort of move us from one research domain to another and find out those resources that might be relevant. And to do that, I want to just pause briefly on the how we find it and tell you a little bit about our educational content created in collaboration with our community champions. And those ones in blue are already available at /educational. The others are in progress. And I'm going to take you through just one of them relating to standards, because that's what we're all here for today. And so when you're looking at our standards infographic, I just want to point out that it will tell you the different types of standards that we've got in Fair Sharing. So I won't spend much time on it now, bearing in mind that one of the subtypes in our standards registry is terminologies. And I appreciate what everyone said about semantic artifacts versus terminologies. We play fast and loose a little bit with what constitutes a terminology, and we're very happy to have a wide range of things here. Just like when we talk about data and Fair Sharing, we mean all sorts of research digital objects, including software and other things. So note that we have done this in collaboration with one of our champions, and we have information about our terminologies. So if we have a closer look at the second page, and the thing I like most about this in our context is the relationships again. So what are the points of these relationships? Well, as an example, many standards are used in combinations as packages, or when you were using a terminology and saying that this terminology works well with this format. So these are the kind of relationships we want to capture. And also, of course, those standards that are implemented by databases and recommended by policies. And if we just take one final look at the last slide, this is, I say, a very high-level overview of what we can offer you. So don't worry that you're not reading everything here. You can have a look at the infographics separately. We have an example, and this is a crosswalk. And I know you guys have been talking about crosswalks in the last hour or so. And while we cannot represent the individual mappings, I use the word mapping. I know it's heavily loaded, Jan, but we'll just use it for now. Within the crosswalk, what we can do is create a live representation of those resources that are described in the crosswalk, and it also creates a relationship graph. So in this particular case of a crosswalk created within an RDA working group, you can see that some resources are already linked, and also further that then the mapping is done, and you go to the underlying document output created by the RDA working group to find out the details of the crosswalk. And so we can create an added level of visibility for the work that you guys do. Let me make sure I thought I'd skipped one yet. So the way they do this and the way that crosswalk was displayed was through something called collections in Fair Sharing. So these are branded pages that you guys can create. You can have a variety of different Fair Impact collections if you wanted, that group selected standards and repositories. Lots of initiatives and projects have already created them for several purposes. I've seen IVOA discussed in the various spreadsheets. They have one. We have working groups from RDA creating those resources, a collection of resources they recommend, but also the crosswalks as we discussed. And if I show you a brief example, on the left, we have the relationship graph for the IVOA standards. And on the right, we have one of the EOSC RIs, EOSC Life, have created a collection of those standards, repositories, and policies that particular cluster uses and endorses. And so you can create a lovely network. It looks a bit like a hairball now, but remember, these are actually dynamic graphs that you can zoom in and out of and click on the nodes and find out more and navigate. So this presentation doesn't really do it justice. And of course, we have live representations of specifications. So this is an example of an ISO standard for biotechnology that uses or lists over 230, well, it might even be exactly 230 standards, yes? And this is telling us lots of information. This is a live graph. So already, if you go to that graph, you'll find that some of those nodes are marked as deprecated. And this is really important as the ISO specification doesn't update that often. You can also look at individual clusters within the larger graph. On the bottom, we have the CDISC cluster that shows all the CDISC relationships. And at the top, we have the PSI cluster. Now, powering third-party tools is a big part of FAIR sharing. And we have worked a lot with FAIR evaluation and data management plan tools. In particular, I want to take us through the example of the EOSC FAIR Metrics and Data Quality Task Force, who have a FAIR Metrics subgroup that's working on common attributes for FAIR assessment. And so we're working with them as we are becoming a sort of single point of truth for a lot of the metadata that the various evaluation tools will need for performing their assessment. So we're working with them to make sure we're providing everything they need, including a way for them to query our API to discover which of those identifier schemas align with the EOSC PID definition. And I know we're talking about PIDs earlier this morning. So some of the ongoing work we're doing as part of this work is the curation within our identifier schema subgroup of which of those align with the EOSC PID policy. We also have a new grant that's just launching, a project launching in February called OS Trails. And these have three tracks, three themes, I guess I'd say, because the track is sitting in their middle, but plan, track, and assess. And this is all about things like the creation of open interoperable knowledge graphs to showcase communities, FAIR implementations. OpenAIRE is a big part of OS Trails. And there's a lot of work around machine actionable data management plans and modular and extendable tests and guidance. So within this context of the OS Trails plan, we are providing a service to help people find resources, but also providing metadata around the standards databases and data policies people will need. To finish off, and I know I've just gone over the 10 minutes here, but that's why I knew that it would probably be slightly over. What can we do for you? Well, we can give you visibility through collections of your resources, through creation of records describing individual resources. We can give you organizational level visibility too, because we have organization FAIR sharing pages that list all relationships and records that are related to that organization. Within an ecosystem of tools, you create a record describing a resource within FAIR Impact, and then that record and that metadata is immediately accessible to all of the third-party tools that make use of our API. And also, you can discover resources. You can explore organizations. And my cat is here. And you can search those graphs, those lovely dynamic graphs of records. And I very quickly made this one just while the previous speakers were talking, and as I saw the agenda for today, because I thought this might be relevant. In the document here, the first recommendation is about cross-domain interoperability frameworks. You can, when you're writing these documents and you're talking about these different levels, these vocabularies and ontologies, you can use FAIR sharing DOIs, so you can have stable PIDs for those resources because the underlying homepages often change or disappear. You can use the relationships in FAIR sharing to help you discover any of these that you might wish to use. Now, we don't actually have everything in the world. You'll be surprised to hear not every single terminology is present in FAIR sharing. We are an entirely manually curated resource. And also we are an academic resource. And so our abilities and number of people are limited. So one of the things you can do, in sort of links through to recommendation 2, is to register anything. So any of the terminologies you might want to describe with and store within your repository of artifacts, you could make sure they're already registered with Fair Sharing or add them if they're not. You could also register that repository itself. In terms of interoperability frameworks for fair sharing within disciplines, well, you can continue to suggest that people within Fair Impact use fair sharing to discover these things. And finally, I already spoke about the PID policy. And so I just wanted to say that one thing you could do is implement the results of this task force output, join the group if you wish. Mark Wilkinson is running it, and also follow any recommendations. And finally, if any of this sounds exciting, you may wish to suggest one or more representatives from Fair Impact to be a fair sharing community champion to help you enact all this lovely stuff within fair sharing, so that you can then in turn receive it through our API. And we already have a number of fair sharing champions. We're sitting somewhere between 15 and 20 from a variety of different domains across all research areas. And they have already contributed since this program began last year to the creation of over 100 records, updating of over 500 records, and nearly 4,000 edits, which is on a par with what all of our maintainers have done to date. Here's a screenshot of our community champions. They're absolutely fabulous, and they get awards pushed to their ORCID profile, as well as a number of other benefits for being a member of the champion program. And then I just wanted to finish, of course, with a thank you for the champions themselves, our stakeholder board, the working group, co-chairs, and our team. I'm happy to take any questions if there's time, or indeed you go ahead and email us if there is no time. And yes, the cat is always looking for attention, especially whenever I start talking. And so maybe she'll come back now that I've finished talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That's really, really interesting. And thank you for this nice summary with the potential collaboration with not only with Fair Impact, maybe with another EOS project. So I think maybe we can spend like 5 minutes or 2 or 3 questions or comment or suggestion. I think it's quite interesting. So I don't know if there is any question. Barbara, Marco, Barbara.
Hi, Alison. Very nice work. Time to write this common story. How do you call it? Success story? I don't know. Fair sharing story. I'm happy to collaborate with you on that. Actually, we have to admit that there are similar approaches in GoFair Foundation and fair sharing, but I think we can make sure that this is still interoperable, and that's what I really try to do. Because we are also collecting these recommendations and the usages from different communities, but we tried to do it in a machine readable way, as you are doing it, but we are using nano publications. So let's just continue on this.
Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. I mean, I don't know how much you've told the other Fair Impact members about that we've done there in the past, but certainly we have integrated the nanopubs that Barbara's doing where relevant with the DOIs from Fair Sharing, and that's a lovely bit of work. And Barbara's done the vast majority of it, so we can thank her.
Yeah, and we continue with this. And I just want to say we are having now qualification, really workflows around this. We've trained people that really know that they have to link to fair sharing DOIs.
Oh, that's absolutely fabulous. And you know, a lot of these things, it's not interoperability. It doesn't mean only one person does everything. You know, as you know,
it's impossible.
Other ways. It's
right.
Just about making sure that we are all able to talk to each other in a machine actionable way. And so that's.
Oh, Marco?
Yeah, maybe a simple or silly question. I've seen the representative for the IVOA community there. What's the difference between that one that I think is a reference person and a champion for a community? Because IVOA represents astrophysics as a domain.
So it's a little hard to hear you, Marco, but I did hear you asked about the representative from IVOA. So a few years ago, someone from IVOA came to us and created a bunch of records with us, and they were the maintainer of all of those records, and they created the collection. And then when they moved on, I think we were trying to get a new maintainer. I'm not sure if they have properly swapped over yet. But there's two different aspects I think you're asking about. Apologies if I get it wrong. On the one hand, you have maintainers which own a particular record, and they can only be a maintainer if they are one of the developers of that resource. So if they're one of the creators of a terminology or a format, or they're one of the developers or managers of a database, yes, then they own it. Their attribution is marked as ownership on the record, and they can edit just that record or the others that they also own. Then our champions have access to the entire registry because they have a broader remit. They look after, so to speak, records within their domain of expertise, and they come to those records and they make sure they're up to date. If there's one that's particular of interest to them or missing, they add ones. So they get attributed in a different way, and they get a line lower in the record that says the following community champions have contributed to this record. And so they have different scope. And so people come as a community champion to do a longer term volunteer effort with us, and people come as maintainers to do short targeted updates, maybe once a year, spending 10 minutes on the record and just making sure it's all up to date.
Okay, thank you for understanding the question and also answering it.
Thanks.
So Clement, just a very quick question because we have to,
that was
finish
just
the meeting.
to,
Sorry.
I mean, Alistair and I did discuss about it quickly, but that's a recall and also a message also so that the others can hear it. But Fair Impact is also producing eventually a specification of an API for semantic artifact catalog. So going back to your second alignment of recommendation between Fair Impact and fair sharing, this is something also fair sharing could continue monitor, because when that will be available, then it will mean that fair sharing be able to grab stuff from different semantic artifact catalogs in that federation. It's not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen right away after Fair Impact, but over the next years, we can expect the semantic artifact catalog to implement that common API. And so services like fair sharing, grabbing stuff from those catalogs more automatically.
Yes, and certainly that would be a great way to update metadata for those, because remember, we wouldn't be a catalog ourselves. We don't store the ontologies. We just describe the ontology, describe the ontology repository or terminology repository.
Yeah, it doesn't solve the metadata record duplication issue things.
Yeah, it does. And just the only issue, we would be very happy to work with you and definitely collaborate on the integration of that, but it would need to be moderated because all records are manually checked and curated. So for instance, if at that point, when you were at that point in the future, you had a champion that worked within that group that could just oversee the merging of the metadata there and check it, so that we had a human there on some point to still say any of that is up to date. Yeah, and correct.
So thank you everybody. Sorry. So thank you everybody for your participation. So sorry for the delay. Just remember that the spreadsheet will be open until December 10th. So you will feel very free to put all your data bad practices and these kind of funny things. And also we are going to prepare a report, and we are going to compile all the material and results that we are collecting to this portion, and we will share with you in an email. So again, thank you for your participation, and I hope you see you in the next workshops. Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.